Welcome to the Institute of Humanities in Africa doctoral seminar, where these sessions are designed to provide an introduction to the intellectual grounding and guidance on the practical tools of the doctoral journey. My name is Angelique Thomas, and I am a doctoral fellow within UMA. As an additional note, I would like to mention that many Zoom users have experienced the unfortunate occurrence of Zoom bombing. To mitigate these issues and try and reduce the risk as much as possible, we ask that all participants kindly change their profile name to their full name and affiliation, or pop those details into the chat box. You might find yourselves temporarily placed in the waiting room otherwise. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Seth Palmer on the topic Being Pilgrim, Being Guest, Balancing Peregrine and Landed Experiences in the Doctoral Research Journey. By way of introduction to our guest speaker, Dr. Seth Palmer is a sociocultural anthropologist whose transdisciplinary work engages religious publics and emergent political imaginaries in Madagascar and the broader Afro-Indian Ocean world. Broadly speaking, Dr. Palmer's scholarship attends to the uncanny ways in which collective turns towards the past, as in concerns over ancestrality and tradition lie at the heart of various future-orientated political aspirations. The book manuscript project considers our spirit possession and its social networks acts as a central conduit for the transnational projects of HIV prevention and queer rights activism in Madagascar. Dr. Palmer's current research interests include religio-political conflict at royal spirit shrines, burgeoning communities at Malagasy Jews, and the afterlives of French colonial and early nationalist racialization processes across the island. Seth, we are thrilled to have you. We're excited for your talk on this topic. I will now hand over to you.
Well, hello, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you to Dr. Sonda for the invitation. And I guess I can go ahead and share my screen now. Is that correct? Okay, I'll do that. So I imagine most of you have had a chance to look at the abstract, and this talk is really more of a meditation than it is necessarily a kind of prescriptive talk on one central tension that I think exists in the doctoral research journey, and that is the one between the pressure to write the stellar dissertation, right? But also the pressure to think beyond the dissertation, to look towards the horizon, towards those future projects, whether they're in academia or whether they're beyond academia, that await you after graduation. Now, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on your perspective, I'm not going to be giving any direct suggestions or advice in this talk necessarily. I don't think there is really a resolution to this tension, but rather I want to just invite some dialogue on the balance between staying on track, given the time, energy, and limited resources that are allocated to graduate students, while also embracing opportunities to stray from the dissertation during the doctoral research journey. So, based on my own admittedly anecdotal evidence and limited experience, I think this ability to find balance between the obligations of a dissertation and future potentialities is really critical, and it's one that I've noticed that separates folks who claim to have found success, whatever that means, however you define that, after the PhD, after the dissertation is stored away somewhere. So drawing upon my own academic history, as a relatively recent PhD graduate, I defended in 2019, and my own ethnographic work in Northwestern Madagascar, I will provide a series of general insights that I hope you may find helpful, or at least thought-provoking as you navigate through your own doctoral research journey. And at the end of my talk, of course, I look forward to conversing with you and hearing about the ways that you find this tension to exist, or maybe solutions or thoughts you have on this set of tensions in your own academic careers. So I'm going to work from two different extended metaphors in my talk today, neither of which are to be taken literally, but both of which are drawn from the lived experiences of interlocutors that I came to know during my doctoral fieldwork in the Betsiboka Valley region of Northwestern Madagascar. But first, I'd like to provide you with a sense of where this is that I was working exactly. So this is obviously a map of Central and northern Madagascar, I've pinned the location of Ambatapuen, which is the rural town where I conducted about half of my doctoral fieldwork. The other half was conducted in the coastal city of Mahadzanga, which you can see here. And if we zoom in, you'll see that the town of Mbatapweni is located on the Betsibuka River. So it is in this region that I conducted much of my work, as well as in the capital city of Antananarivo. Now, compared to other regions of Madagascar, with the exception perhaps of the capital city in Antananarivo and other obviously regional urban centers on the island, Northwestern Madagascar is arguably one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse provinces in the country. Its cosmopolitan nature is reflected in the ethnographic scholarship on the region, which notes the ongoing and constant tension between those who are known as Vahin in Malagasy, meaning guests, literally, or ethnic outsiders who migrate into the region in search of employment, and the autochthonous population who identify as Sakalav, right, who are considered in Malagasy Tumpuntan, literally the masters of the land. So this conflict between populations who migrate into the community and those who are understood to be indigenous or have ancestral ties to the land is one that occurs right throughout Madagascar. And folks who are familiar with Madagascar will be familiar with that tension. Of course, this is a tension that exists in many places beyond Madagascar as well on the continent. So the first waves of guests of these Vahini, these migrants who come to this region near Mbatapweni where I worked, were from the Central Highlands, and they come in the 1820s. These peoples later organized under the ethnonym Merina as their own empire with the help of the British, conquered the indigenous Sakalav Empire in this strip of the Northwest. Indigenous Sakalav monarchs in this region at times, and actually in the beginning, completely resisted Merina rule. However, where I worked in Mbatu, eventually Sakalav royals kind of accepted their fate and started to coordinate their efforts with the conquerors, with the Merina aristocracy. So you later had other migrants coming from different regions of Madagascar, from the southwest, from the east, who come during the colonial era as there are plantations constructed in the region and folks are working in these rice, cotton, or tobacco plantations. Indo-Pakistani potters from Gujarat later arrived in the region in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Here is an image of one of their mosques. In fact, their particular mosque in the rural town of Mbatapweni. There's another mosque where Comorians would go to pray. Other foreigners who moved into the Betsibuka Valley included Senegalese soldiers who fought for the French, Greek merchants and gold hunters, Comorian entrepreneurs and traders. So without going too deep into the details around what it means to meet a migrant guest in this region, I just want to note that it's not necessarily a specific racialized ethnic category as much as it is a discursive category that performs certain political work, right? Because informal territorial claims are determined based on your ancestral connection to the land. Okay, so the question is, what does this have to do with the central kind of focus of my talk here? Well, I think it's interesting to think about university culture, right, as its own sort of culture. Is a picture from my own alma mater, University of Toronto. And this act of settling into a foreign space, as many Malagasy migrants do, is something that we do twice over as PhD students. First, we enter what is, for many of us, the foreign culture of academia, or specifically, a PhD program. And all students, but particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, and here I'm speaking specifically from a North American context, but this could include first-generation college students, poor students, queer students, international students, students from underserved rural and urban communities, Black and Indigenous students, right? All of students positioned in such a way are going to find it to be more challenging to make a space for themselves in this often elitist and Eurocentric culture. I could go on, but the point is, right, this takes some level of emotional labor, again, depending on the student's positionality within that particular space. It can seem more or less foreign, that is. But secondly, PhD students have to settle into their research project. This includes the typical issues of clearly defining your research question, those bodies of literature that the project engages, and those theories that the project employs. As you all well know, I am sure a dissertation cannot and should not do it all. I also don't have to tell you that PhD students have limited time and funding, so the challenge of settling or nestling into your university, your program, and your dissertation project is absolutely critical. So just as those migrant guests came to the Betsibuka Valley, often in search of labor, and settled into those pursuits with time, PhD students often arrive to do the work of finding their niche area of intellectual labor within their discipline. So some things to consider, and these are things that I imagine you are already in the process of considering, things like, is the dissertation engaging with only a few select literatures? Is it making a clear intervention, right? That's the difference between a dissertation that's simply descriptive versus one that's attempting to change the terms of debate within this set of literatures. I also think it's important to think about ways in which you start to develop your own voice, right, as a scholar who is, again, making a clear set of interventions. And lastly, of course, many of you are likely already working in some sort of teaching context as you dissertate, I imagine. So these are all elements of what it means to kind of come into your own during that PhD process, okay? However, these sets, these goal sets that one may have during the PhD program exist very much in tension with the other pursuit that is looking towards the horizon. As I have here, this is an image of some spirit mediums that I worked with in the Betsibuka Valley who are returning from a pilgrimage back home, again, walking towards the horizon. So these expectations, those expectations set around the dissertation, always rest in tension with the second extended metaphor, which I will employ and which is also drawn upon my fieldwork. I spent much time with spirit mediums, specifically queer spirit mediums, many of whom regularly engage in pilgrimages to spirit shrines. Visiting these shrines on a regular basis is seen as an expression of commitment to those spirits that, quote, sit upon a medium. The term in Malagasy here, mipechak, literally means to sit upon or to live within, but it's also seen as a commitment to the monarchical political system of which mediumship is a part. So I'm going to spare you all the details on spirit possession in Madagascar, but for our purposes here, I want to consider the curiosity, play, vitality that many of my spirit medium friends engage in. These are defining characteristics of pilgrimage. And as pilgrims, these interlocutors regularly traveled to distant shrines, and it is in this sense that they lived peregrine lives. While often rooted in one place, they had one central home. At times, interlocutors from the eastern coast of Madagascar, the far southwest, would travel to the northwest during the dry season when these annual ritual pilgrimages occurred, and would spend weeks, right, moving around from one rural location to another where there were shrines. So now let's connect this to this other set of tensions, right, around the playfulness of thinking, of moving about, as it were, outside of the strict confines of your dissertation project. It's important to not be so rigid that you aren't open to new experiences and possibilities. And I think that this is especially true for those of us who are ethnographers, because ethnography is based on lived experience, right? We may arrive in a community with a set research question, right? But inevitably that research question will change during the ethnographic encounter itself, and in fact, probably should change. This is a sort of flexibility that, of course, I imagine has been key to completing graduate studies under COVID, right? Can the scholar effectively consider how the research will address the methodological and epistemological questions posed by COVID, for example? Remaining open to new possibilities is important for a number of reasons. And for those who will eventually find employment in academia, by exploring side projects, I think you'll be better able to articulate second projects in the applications of postdoctoral research positions and faculty positions. Can you, for example, write a 2-page statement on your research interests that actually doesn't talk too much about your dissertation, that's focused mostly on other things, other pursuits? And this is a fairly standard document that research committees will ask for in applications in the North American context anyway. So for those of you who eventually find employment outside of academia, it is precisely by taking up side pursuits that you will also make important connections with professionals outside of academia that match your skill sets. So this playfulness is, involves collecting information that goes beyond, the strict confines of a dissertation. Are you making connections with interesting colleagues along this journey? Are you noticing what you find rewarding and don't find rewarding about your work? Again, in many ways, this seems intuitive, but I do think it's important for students to be thinking about that while they are dissertating. So lastly, I'd like to briefly outline 2 side projects that interested me. Both of these events emerged during my doctoral fieldwork, and I didn't aim to work or write on these topics, but rather they seem to have found me, right? This experience that is, so familiar to those of you who are ethnographers, I imagine. But what's interesting, I think, about them is they actually helped me to solidify my broader research questions that interest me as an interdisciplinary scholar beyond, again, the strict confines of my dissertation project. So while I was in the city of Majunga, I heard about a fight that broke out at the village of Beitsiuk, which is also the site of one of the most important shrines and royal cemeteries in the Malagasy Northwest. The conflict occurred during a ritual observance at the shrine as Christian evangelists had arrived, facing off against mediums, pilgrims, and supplicants, and threatening to burn the site to the ground. While conducting fieldwork, I also regularly visited this village and slowly but surely interviewed a number of different actors who had been present at the event. I'm now in the middle of the process of writing an article based on this story, but it was only really possible thanks to my own wandering research interests, right? If I tried to stick to the project, I wouldn't have collected such kind of accounts from folks in the community. And secondly, and lastly, upon moving to the town of Mbatu, I stumbled upon a religious community that was known as Jews, Jiosy in Malagasy, Jews in English. They wore clothing that differed from everyone else in town. They lived in a camp by the river, excluded from everyone else. Other residents in town refused to even greet them in the street, something which is completely unheard of in northwestern Madagascar, as well as other regions of the island. And rumors circulated about this group as bone stealers and snake worshippers. Now, the metaphor I'm going to employ here is a bit much, perhaps, but spirit mediums in Madagascar are understood to become taken over by another person while in trance. And while the comparison here is not quite fair, I too found myself kind of taken over by this intense curiosity to know more about this community, to hear about their stories. And actually, in many ways, I found it sometimes more interesting than my own doctoral fieldwork that was supposed to be focused on queer spirit mediums, or equally interesting. Time does not permit me here to go on in detail about this particular religious community. But since then, I found out that Judaism and narratives about the lost tribes of Israel play an important role in contemporary Malagasy society, as they do in other parts of the continent, including in South Africa. So in closing, I'm suggesting in part that it is a bad idea to reduce all research work that isn't immediately productive to procrastination, right? Had I not strayed in some ways from the dissertation project, which again was centrally connected, focused on this connection between spirit possession and queer activism in Madagascar, I would not have been able to have kind of planted the seeds, as it were, for these next 2 future projects. So I will end my talk here, and I look forward to discussing these sets of tensions with everyone. Thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks so much for this talk. As a doctoral student, I really appreciated the way in which you spoke about the way in which you approach this talk as a meditation, and how you spoke about navigating the difficulties both within the doctoral project, but also the possibilities beyond. I will now ask if there's anyone who would like to ask a question or comment on the presentation. You can either raise a hand on the Zoom feature or pose your question in the comment or chat should you feel more comfortable. As people start thinking about their questions, I thought I could maybe start off. So I guess when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how to decide when to remain focused on your topic and when it's okay to kind of veer off and move into other areas, because you could also go pretty far off and then completely like miss. And I guess my question is kind of how far is too far? And yeah, basically.
Yeah, it's a great question. Perhaps at times I did do that when I was in Madagascar, and in some ways, as ethnographers, there's this problematic kind of romantic idea that this is the space to explore, and sometimes explore in ways that can get you off track from your PhD project, but also in ways that I don't know, that could get one confused to one's own self, I imagine. In very practical terms, I think it's helpful to give a talk, a conference talk, like one talk on one possible future project while you're dissertating. I think that I found that to be fruitful personally, because it was also very short, right? And talks are going to be 15, 20 minutes long, so you can't go on and on, but it also gives you kind of a mental break and a sense of motivation. And for me, again, I think what I found so interesting is that had it not been for these two projects, I would not have been able to articulate, as you introduced me in the beginning, with my kind of broader research, and I would not have been able to articulate that unless I had engaged in these interviews and long-term participant observation with these other groups. So it could be something as simple as, one or two talks and limiting it to that. Maybe you start a particular folder in Google Drive where every once in a while, like, one or, I don't know, a day, once every 2 weeks or so, you allow yourself to work on that. But I've never been good with structure or organization, so I'm not going to pretend that I am good at that right now. So maybe that's why I'm giving a talk on how to avoid structure.
Thanks so much, Seth. Divine added 2 questions in the chat. I'll read it out, unless Divine, you'd like to come on and do it. Okay, no problem. So Divine asks, the idea of the journey as spiritual is a fascinating one. Can you expatiate further? Also, the tension between completing and writing the winning dissertation, especially in a world obsessed with excellence. What does one do with this tension, and how do you navigate the tension?
Those are fantastic questions. I think in terms of being a spiritual journey, it's quite interesting, because I was spending every day with folks who were thinking about their experience beyond the human one. And so intellectually, I was intrigued by that, but I don't think I ever took any time to kind of do any self-exploration, including up until now. But it seems to be fitting, I think, for this project, but probably, again, I can only speak as an ethnographer. I think this is probably true for most ethnographers, right? That there's something deeply personal in our work. In terms of the tension between completing, this, or writing the dissertation, and, well, it sounds like the question is one about how do you write when the expectation is one of excellence. And I'm not, I'm sure you've already heard this before as well, but I've been told, a complete dissertation is the best dissertation. It doesn't have to be excellent. And the fact that you've gotten this far means you probably are on a topic that is understudied, or your particular angle is unique. And that can be enough, because it's really, frankly, in like an article that you might write on 1 or 2 chapters that are particularly strong, that I think is is in many ways more interesting because more people, frankly, are likely to read that, to engage that, right, to become exposed to that. And it's also maybe an opportunity to think about, other ways of putting your work out there in the world beyond the dissertation. So there's a kind of fetishization of the dissertation that, again, in terms of the world of academia, in terms of employment, almost no one will read your dissertation beyond the committee. No one, it's very rare for people to take the time to read dissertations. So I think it's important to step back and think about what your intervention is. That will frame the introduction, and that will, encapsulate, how do people, after people read a particular chapter, to like, what will they carry with them? And so I think that is a form of excellence that doesn't need to be incredibly overwhelming, because it doesn't need to be a particularly long dissertation, right, necessarily. Obviously, I can't speak for particular programs or advisors, right? It's hard to make generalizations about any of this. Yes, a good PhD is a finished PhD. And I can certainly say that in terms of the mental health of myself and many other folks who were PhD students, right? That sometimes you build up the PhD to something that you build it up almost too much, right? It is just a dissertation, and there are other ways of sharing your thoughts with the world that are just as powerful, and probably, frankly, more so.
Thanks so much, Seth. Dominique, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Angelique, and thank you, Seth. This is all music to my ears. Okay, first, I've read your PhD dissertation. Just want to say that.
Thank you.
It's not just the
I've read yours.
Exactly. So I was going to say, I know you cited mine, so I know at least it's not true for the two of us. So yeah, no, it's yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I loved your meditation also on like how to to find other path and other interests. I wonder if this is something that I've always said to students that I had to supervise for a research project. Like write on everything, or like more than your subject, because you never know like what connection you're going to find in the future, and you want to have like the wealth of of this ethnography, and this is like such a fantastic resource. But I wonder, when I've done that in context where I also was supervising students that were not anthropologists, and sometimes I'm like, am I just like speaking from my position as an ethnographer, where like you've done, I've carried out field work like for like, I don't know, 18 months, and so I had like all the time in the world. And I was also terribly bored in the evening, so I could write about anything. So I wonder if it's something that is very specific to our discipline, and the participant observation, the kind of like the temporality of it, and our ability as anthropologists to find so many connections in the social world. So I wonder. Yeah, and they're here in the room. Like, you haven't been introduced to like the student, but there's a lot of PhD candidates that are not necessarily ethnographers or anthropologists, at least. But yeah, so that would be my question: how specific it is. And second, it's a question because it's a selfish question, but I'm so excited about your project, on this Malagasy Jewish community, and I wonder if it's related to like the history of other pariahs, especially in the southeast of Madagascar. Those that have been described by Bojar or else. But we can have this discussion maybe later. But I'm very excited to hear. I've been also very interested in like those communities, reading Flacourt and Zafir Ibrahim, etc. There's so many, like, I think, exciting,
Yes.
things to learn about. Yeah. But I wonder about the connection with the pariah, because it seems like that is an extreme form of exclusion that you're describing. But looking forward to reading your research on that. Thank you.
Thanks.
For being here.
Yeah, I would love to chat about this at some point. So maybe I'll start my response by saying that part of why their status as pariah, I mean, I think that's an appropriate term. They were so extremely othered in town that what prompted, it prompted me to think about the queerness of the subject as someone who's interested in queer theory. Like, in a way, they were pushed outside of the normal boundaries of membership in this rural community. And so in some ways they were queerer than some of the queer subject mediums that I was working with. And so I thought there's, as you had just said, there's something to that. Like, this is a question that I need to follow up on. And I think it is certainly true that as ethnographers, we have, ethnographers who have, certain time and funding, like, we have the ability to, and not only the ability to follow these strands, but we are often pushed, and I think in a healthy way, by advisors who are saying, yes, please follow all those strands, because you will never have this opportunity again, most likely, right, to explore a bit of everything. So I think for those of us who are ethnographers and have that time and energy, it's important. But on a practical level, I do think, like, if students are interested in pursuing academia, like, a research statement is true to no matter what discipline, right? Even if you're an English lit person or comparative lit or whatnot. So I think, and I can't speak for those disciplines, but it might be interesting or useful to, again, start a Google Drive folder, some sort of organizational schema where you give yourself a very set amount of time per week or per 2 weeks to, like, this is a side thing that kind of interests me. I want to read a couple articles, push out a conference paper on it, right? And especially if it's, research that presumably you're doing from home and don't need to travel to complete, that could be a bit easier. But I think this is something that, doctoral students who don't even consider what's next, and I know it would just stress me out to even think about this. So in some ways I hate bringing this up in such a talk, but so for many of you are like, of course I'm thinking about this. I've always been thinking about this, but there are some who, like, you don't, many of my friends who didn't. And then it sort of hit them like a wall of bricks kind of at the end. So I think it's something that's important to think about throughout. But yeah, there's something about this pariahness of that particular Malagasy Jews community. They were actually Seventh-day Adventists that had broken off from the church in the Northeast in the Indapa region. And there's a very long story that I could tell here, but basically there was some problematic things that occurred within that community that were called out within that community. And as a result, the leader of that group was arrested and imprisoned. And in many ways, I was kind of, I did not know about any of these events, but I was the one, I was really the one person in town who would go to them and talk to them, randomly through the day, bring them things from the market, etc. So I was already living with a great deal of stigma during my field work for various reasons, and that just added a third kind of layer that was very interesting. So, obviously, I occupied a place of extreme privilege as a white, white person doing field work in this area, but in other ways, I myself there was some pariahness to me that was kind of interesting to explore through them. I could go on and on about the Jews, but
okay, like I wish it was like, only people were interested in Madagascar. But I think it's a fascinating case that you are exploring in very, I think, very new. So it's quite exciting for me.
I wanted to ask a question. So you spoke a bit about, being a white male doing this work, but also veering off and kind of playing, I guess, as a doctoral student in the global South, wanting to contribute to conferences, publishing, and all of those things. Divine asked Seth White.
Yeah.
Um,
Extreme. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately. Yeah.
And so to even play itself does kind of feel like a privilege, you know? I mean, for me specifically, I'm thinking about all the things that I need to do for my dissertation and the outputs I want to produce that's as close to my research to like have a strong voice within my field. But to just even allow myself to veer a bit off seems like it requires the luxury of time and funding that would allow me to do that. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously all of what you said is very true. I also think it's important, though, that part of what I talked about with play was not so much me. I mean, I think that's true. Ethnographers are doing that through participant observation, right? But we are, that was something I picked up from my interlocutors. And I write about that a lot, is that spirit mediumship and possession includes, in this context, a kind of vitality and an exploration of what it means to live one's life, even in the context of being a stigmatized subject. Many of these are, again, queer interlocutors and subjects. So the play is partly mine, but it's also partly theirs, right? And I think also something that I found is, I mean, this is kind of a story in coming into your own voice as an ethnographer, but you might just find that by veering off, you produce a conference paper that might actually be more interesting than your doctoral research, or might, I mean, as Dominique is saying, like, this is the really interesting project. And I've heard many people say that about the Malagasy Jews project. And in some ways, to me, maybe it feels more exciting because one becomes so tired of one's own dissertation work, right? But I think, yes, you might have certain goals that are associated with a dissertation, but again, writing a conference paper, even thinking about articulating that second project in a short piece in a public venue could be a way of getting your name, your interests out there to a broader public. And someone might be like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I would love to contact Angelique about this. So there's a great deal of privilege having the kind of time and energy to play with this, but also I don't know if everything needs to take up as much time as a dissertation, right? I think there's ways of exploring these questions that are, that could be shorter, more efficient. You're just planting seeds, right? And these seeds will not all grow. I have many other little projects that, nothing came of it. So yeah, that's a very important point, though.
Thanks, Seth. Mimi, would you like to ask your question or comment?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Angelique, and thank you, Seth, for sharing your metaphors, which really had me thinking about what you've been saying about the tensions in the PhD process. And just looking at the comments, one from Divine here, he says that how do you manage being a PhD student when there's so much tension? And also a funny one that says a dissertation is a boring entrapment and must be done with. I completely agree, honestly. I think before I started this PhD, I was really obsessed by, oh my gosh, it has to be this amazing thing. It has to be, what is my proposal? I think I had more than 5 different research proposals on different topics. I'm not kidding. Because I was really trying to imagine this grand topic that would, change the world. And I was like, then when I took a step back, I realized, actually, I have a whole life outside the PhD, which I need to live. So PhD is not my life, and I have other things, a whole afterlife after PhD. So it really helps me to not be too obsessed with my project, And I'm hoping that by the time I write the dissertation, I will actually finish and hand it in and not be very obsessed. And also just to comment on the tension on well, kind of what I've been experiencing is situating myself or exploring where I want to be after the PhD. Do I want to be in academia? A part of me says yes. Do I want to have some to speak to applied work in the innovation space? Yes. So there are different areas where I try to say, okay, I want to contribute here. I want to have a conversation with these professionals to add value to what I want to do. But at the same time, I'm very cautious about prioritizing the PhD, because if you become too absorbed in your side projects, you end up spending too much time on the dissertation, and you've got a cutoff. The fund is not going to fund you for up to 10 years. So you have to finish. So it's always like trying to balance during the priorities, of course, making those important connections, but setting goals and knowing that you have to meet them. At least I just wanted to share that. Yeah, and just knowing that the PhD is not like your entire life. You don't want to submit the PhD and then die. You want to submit the PhD and live, and you have a whole life ahead.
Thanks, Mimi. I love that you said it's the afterlife. Because the PhD is like a life and then the afterlife. But Seth, would you like to respond to Mimi?
Yeah, I would. I just think those points are all incredibly astute and mature in a way that I think most of us, including myself, who were in the middle of the PhD process, couldn't see beyond. And I mean, I don't know what else you have talked about as a group throughout this past semester, but I mean, I think this is to the detriment of the mental health of many PhD students, and I don't think it's talked about enough. That it is built up by advisors, by advisors who did not write a dissertation in these times, by advisors who did not go on the job market in these times, right? So I think it's important as this kind of next generation of scholars to craft your own ways of thinking about what makes a purposeful life as an intellectual, however you want to define that, right? And part of that might be not living for the dissertation, or thinking about, this is a really strong chapter in the dissertation. I'm really proud of it. And I want to make this into a strong article. Great, right? And the rest of the dissertation can be what it is. But I think that we need to demystify like what the dissertation is and can do, and think about other possible venues for, again, putting our work out into the world. And it is absolutely true that there is an important counter talk to my talk, which is great, have fun, play, but also stay, on track. And I think this idea of play, just to go back to it one more time, is like, where are you finding joy in this process? I know that sounds so simple, but as Dr. Sumda says, every occupation is boring at some point. Absolutely, right? So there's a kind of romanticization of what it means to occupy a faculty position, right? That might be completely divorced from the reality of that. And it will depend on what kind of faculty position you occupy as well. So what gives you a sense of purpose? What gives you a sense of joy? Again, kind of obvious point in statement, but one that often gets forgotten from the perspective, I think, of PhD advisors at top universities who want students to do their best work, which sometimes actually isn't reaching the world in ways that are the most effective, creative, imaginative, purposeful.
Thanks, Seth. As it says in the comments, that this also applies to postdoctoral research projects, by the way, but are not living for academia. Seth, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about how you actually chose the subject and how it all started for you.
Of my PhD dissertation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So, oh goodness, it started many years ago. I was living in La Réunion, Reunion Island. Since you're in South Africa, that's not so far away. You may be familiar with that. When I say Reunion Island in North America, no one knows what I'm talking about. So I lived there for 2 years. I made several friends. I made Malagasy friends as well. And I went to Madagascar, and as a queer person, I found it very interesting to see what life was like for some of my queer friends at the time. These would have been, they were folks who were kind of lived in the capital city, were of the upper class in Tana. And so my project took many meandering turns once I entered a PhD program, and actually went to Madagascar. And I thought initially I was going to do research on queer activism amongst Sarambav, which is a Malagasy term, which literally translates to in the image of a woman, folks that we would read as in LGBTQ parlance, kind of like trans women sex workers. And I realized that I didn't enjoy that fieldwork, speaking of play and joy, because it meant doing fieldwork at night, which was very dangerous and in fact increased the danger that my friends and interlocutors could experience as sex workers. I drew attraction in terms of like violence as a white person who was presumed to have money and power. So I thought this doesn't make sense. This isn't what I'm looking for. And in fact, I kind of went into the PhD thinking I probably won't get a faculty position. This is my one chance in life to like be able to explore an idea over an extended period of time. And so I traveled to the Northwest and discovered that the one main public figure for the LGBTQ rights movement in Madagascar is a spirit medium. And she engages in these pilgrimages herself, and her trips to small towns where she will hold table ronde, these like a round tables with like police and sometimes local doctors to talk about LGBT rights issues, coincided with these pilgrimages to rural shrines located near the towns. And so the project kind of expanded to thinking about the US Embassy in Madagascar coming in to support LGBT rights as a kind of political move, right? And thinking about homo nationalism and other ideas that may be familiar to folks with some familiarity into queer theory or queer African studies. But part of it really was, I think, the experience of doing fieldwork, living alongside these folks who were so incredibly creative and imaginative, that was really inspiring and interesting for me. And then especially to be able to meet queer elders. So the fair amount of the dissertation, actually the book, I hope to emphasize more of that wasn't in the dissertation, was intergenerational friendships between elderly queer persons in Madagascar, many of whom were spirit mediums, some of whom were spirit mediums, Christians and Muslims. Muslim would identify as spirit medium, Christian and Muslim, all three. So there's incredible religious plurality in northwestern Madagascar. So yes, these are, could go on and on, right? But these are some of the things that really drew me to the project as opposed to the one that I had initially imagined.
As an immediate question, would they themselves identify as queer?
No. So there's an incredibly complex, this is kind of why I kind of go around it in my talk, because there's no one term, right? I mean, the framing that often happens is it's like the West comes in with LGBTQ and, colonizes through this kind of linguistic colonization. And then there's this indigenous form. Well, in Madagascar, there's so many different levels and layers to this regionally, but also there's a quote unquote secret in-group lexicon, a whole kind of vocabulary that's used primarily by queer men and their sex worker friends, female sex worker friends, and that has recently been outed, as it were, in a Malagasy TV film series called Vula that I'm starting to write about. That's really interesting. There's a queer character who's using some of these terms that now enter like bub. I'm saying this because Dr. Sunda's in the call, which now means Vula, like money. But young folks in Tana, for example, if you say bub, everyone knows it means money. But initially, it was a term that was used by these queer men. So there are terms like that for different kinds of gender expressions, sexual positions, interests. I could go on and on about all of them. So part of what interests me as an anthropologist is the fact that people don't agree on what term. They have different ways of coming to terms with these terms, just as we do, right? Just as all of us do. And just as kind of LGBTQ activists fight over like the correct term, right? All people do that. All humans kind of theorize these categories of making sense of their world. But yeah, queer is not a term that they use. And in fact, of course, in these rural areas, most of them do not know LGBT or T, but many of them in Majanga or Tana might know MSM, which may be a familiar concept for many of you in this call, men who have sex with men, that comes out of this public health framework way of understanding sexuality.
So fascinating. I've done a lot of work with men who have sex with men and trans people and sex workers, so I could go on, but I want to give space for the conversation happening in the chat at the moment. Divine asked, what is the PhD for, if not for academia? And then as I responded, not everyone has a PhD that ends in academia, and Babaka then added, I always have a hard time understanding why some people do doctoral research, get their PhDs, and then go work outside academia forever. Why do a PhD if we don't want to work in academia? Then, as I said, that it takes more than a PhD to survive in academia. And I was wondering if you could just contribute your comments to that conversation they're having.
I love that. It takes more than a PhD to survive in academia. It sure does. And I think part of that comes with finding a sense of play and purpose in what you're doing, right? A love for what you're doing. And, I can say from my very privileged advantage point of having, gotten a faculty position, that for me, it comes to students, students for whom I get to talk about their lived experiences and kind of broaden their horizons. So for me, teaching gives a sense of purpose in some ways that research doesn't, because it's very rare for me to get opportunities like this to be able to talk with folks about my research. So yeah, let's demystify that. These are very rare moments indeed that occur after the PhD. I think it's if someone wants to, Babakar's comment, I read that as saying, why do a PhD if you don't want to work in academia? I mean, I only know the North American academic job market. It's incredibly competitive. Chances are you won't get a position. That's just the reality. I think that it's for me, as I said, I actually went into the PhD not expecting to necessarily be able to work in academia, but I thought this is an incredible privilege that, at the University of Toronto, you're guaranteed, I was guaranteed 5 years funding. And then on top of that, I was able to kind of craft funding for the fieldwork period itself. But like, that is an incredible gift to have those years in my 20s to be able to connect with interlocutors in a different place, or whatever it is outside of anthropology, to ask these questions that will certainly inform the rest of your life and the way that you view the world, and the way whatever work you do after this will presumably be informed by not only the skills, like the concrete skills that you get from a PhD, but also that expanded worldview. So I think, perhaps, I can't speak for you, but once you get on the job market, you might see why. It's incredibly grim. So unfortunately, and again, I only know the North American context, so that's what I can speak to.
We can probably take one or two questions if there are any. I might take one of those two if there's nobody else. Dominique, go ahead. Tom, can you hear me?
Yeah, I sorry, my connection has become very unstable. Can you hear me as well? Okay, yeah. No, yeah, I just wanted to react to Babakar, and first, that's a good idea for another doctoral seminar. Like, what do you use a PhD for? But I think there's in the job markets, there's a market for and a demand for doctors, right? And as I don't know, Seth, if it's something that you encounter as an educator, as a professor in a US university, but we have to think about that as we educate and we train, even undergrads, etc. We are not educating like, you know, future professors, or we have to make the discipline or discipline matter for others, right? Because, and for other career path. Otherwise, you know what, there's no sense. There's very few jobs. We all know that. I believe strongly that, you know, PhD are excellent ways to acquire skills that you can, you know, use in many other careers. So yeah, and you know, and yeah, many organizations are asking for doctors, and you know, there's like financial also benefits sometimes, even to have like a PhD over a master. So I don't know. That's a conversation that I think we should have. But Seth, I don't know if you want to, you know, to address that. Now that you are like, you know, in a teaching position, how do you envision, like, you know, training people for research?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's very, I think, especially those of us who do PhDs at R1 institutions, research-based institutions, even if you went to school, as I did, my undergraduate experience was at a small teaching college, like one forgets, right, how that experience kind of worked, or never knew what that was like as from the professor's perspective. So for me, like I'm actually teaching a 300 level course in African studies. It's essentially an intro to critical African studies course. We have 9 students, and the only prereq is that they've taken intro to cultural anthropology. So you can imagine, I have a student who's a social work major. I have a student who's interested in criminology, but luckily the good, you know, anti-racist, kind of form of criminology. So how is it that one makes these issues pertinent to them in their lives is of utmost importance to me, and it's incredibly challenging. I think it's more difficult to teach such a course to kind of a broader kind of undergraduate student than it is if I was teaching at a large institution where students had come into this class with like 4 anthropology courses or other courses in African American studies, or had some sense of who, I'm teaching that who is Fanon, like I'm having to have that conversation in a 300 level course titled African Studies, right? So this is the reality of most faculty positions, right? Certainly in North America. And, but it's also in a sense, again, like very empowering to know that I'm not just writing an article that's going to be read for 3 people, or by 3 people, or I'm not just training 10 PhD students who are going to write kind of elite articles in elite journals, but I'm actually, in a sense, being able to touch all these lives that will touch all these other lives in some way. So yeah, I think what Dr. Samda has mentioned is key to the experience of being in a teaching focused position.
Seth, you've created quite the conversation on the chat, and I'm not going to go through all of it.
Okay.
Oh no.
No, it's a good conversation that I would hope we all continue to do. But we've run out of time. So thank you, Seth, so much for this insightful discussion. My hope is that participants would leave here today having learned much from your experiences and work, but also that this would be the start of an even wider conversation for all of us. As we end, I'd like to alert all guests to upcoming events. Our next doctoral seminar will be held on Wednesday, the 8th of December at 4 p.m, where Lord Estelle will present a talk titled Filmed, Felt and False Rhythms, Ethnographies of Dance in the Age of Globalization. All future events can also be found on the UMA webpage at uma.uct.ac.za. Thanks for joining, take care and stay safe, everyone.